A flight attendant disrespected a black CEO's teen, but he had no idea the father was watching, ready to take decisive action that left the entire cabin stunned. A flight attendant punched a black CEO's teen who was standing on crutches, believing the boy's weakness made him an easy target. He didn't realize the father standing behind him was the man who could end entire careers with a single decision. The moment that strike landed, the CEO's plan activated. Subscribe if you believe arrogance collapses instantly when true power steps forward. Slow passengers ruining schedules, Reddick Marr muttered as he passed row 11, his voice low enough to pretend it wasn't directed at anyone, yet sharp enough to slice through the cabin's quiet hum. The words landed like a slap. 16-year-old Kiren Darrin paused mid-step, his crutches wobbling slightly beneath him. The morning light streaming through the aircraft windows reflected off his cast as he tried to steady himself, shoulders tightening not from pain, but from the sting of being noticed and judged. He didn't look up. He had learned that looking up often led to confrontation, and confrontation was never worth it. He simply adjusted his stance and moved forward, each step deliberate, each breath measured. His father, Dr. Jorvan Darrin, followed close behind, watching his son's subtle reaction with the kind of quiet focus only a parent could carry. Jorvan's stride was calm, deliberate, not just the pace of a protective father, but of a man used to measuring people before they even spoke. He hadn't missed Reddick's words. He rarely missed anything. As they reached their assigned seats in row 14, Kiren began the awkward process of turning and lowering himself gently into the window seat. Jorvan extended a steadying hand without speaking, offering balance, dignity, and silent encouragement. It was a motion they had practiced many times since the accident, an unspoken rhythm between father and son. As Kiren settled in, exhaling slowly, Jorvan stored the moment like a timestamp in his memory. Reddick moved past again, this time glancing back with the kind of look that tried to disguise itself as neutral, but failed. The corners of his mouth tightened and his eyes narrowed as he looked at the crutches now propped between the seats. He adjusted an overhead bin aggressively just behind them, as though the sound might provoke someone into reacting. No one did. Not yet. Patience always reveals character, Jorvan said quietly as he knelt to tuck Kiren's tablet case under the seat. His voice was even, his tone neither warning nor threat, just a truth spoken aloud for his son, but meant for anyone with ears. Kiren nodded silently, his eyes still lowered, pretending to focus on his notes for the adaptive limb presentation they would give later that week. In truth, his stomach was beginning to churn. The transition from home to public life after the accident had been difficult enough. Being physically slowed meant being emotionally exposed, and the journey was more than just miles in the air, it was endurance in silence. Jorvan eased into his own seat beside Kiren, exuding a presence that was both reserved and commanding. Tall, clean-shaven, dressed in a charcoal blazer and deep navy shirt without a single wrinkle, he carried the calm of someone who had negotiated billion-dollar deals yet knew when to remain completely silent. His reputation in the tech world as CEO of Nexleran Systems was more than just legacy. It was precision, ethics, and restraint sharpened into habit. Meanwhile, Reddick returned to the front of the plane, gesturing toward a small bag that hadn't been fully zipped in an overhead bin. His irritation hadn't subsided. He was a tall man with prematurely graying hair and sharp cheekbones, his uniform crisp but his body language coarse. To the untrained eye, he was simply another overworked flight attendant. But the way he moved, controlling space with subtle aggression, demanding compliance without words, spoke of someone who found satisfaction in the discomfort of others, especially those he saw as weaker or slower. Passengers continued to board, the cabin filling with murmurs, rustling carry-ons, and occasional apologies. Through it all, Reddick remained on edge, sighing loudly whenever someone paused too long or adjusted a bag more than once. He never yelled. He didn't need to. His tone alone communicated disdain. As the minutes passed, Jorvan observed him, watching not with fear but with curiosity, the same way he might examine a flawed algorithm or a misaligned circuit. He recognized the type, a man who mistook unchallenged authority for respect, a man whose confidence came not from competence but from the absence of consequence. What Reddick didn't know and couldn't have guessed was who he had just dismissed. To him, Kiren was just a slow kid with a cast, a burden to a tight schedule. To him, Jorvan was just another quiet father who would look away, shuffle his son down the aisle and forget it all by landing. But beneath that silence was something else entirely. As Kiren pulled out a small sketchbook of his limb design prototypes, he glanced briefly at his father. Jorvan gave a subtle nod, the kind that meant, "You're doing fine," without needing to say it. Then, without breaking the rhythm of the moment, he reached into his breast pocket and tapped his pen against the inner lining. It was a gesture of habit, of anticipation. It also happened to press gently against the embedded ID card stitched discreetly into his blazer, a passcode that, if needed, could access the audit systems of over 24 international airlines, including Helion Air. But today wasn't about Jorvan. Not yet. A few rows back, a businessman in a blue tie whispered to his seatmate, "Tense crew today." His seatmate nodded in agreement, adjusting his belt buckle. Tension wasn't loud on this flight. It was quiet, like a wire slowly pulled tight. The seatbelt sign chimed. Reddick passed again. His eyes landed on Kiren's crutches. They were tucked in, out of the aisle, perfectly compliant. Still, he stared at them as if they were an inconvenience. No words this time, just a scoff and a disapproving shake of the head. Jorvan turned slightly, his eyes following the man's movement. He said nothing. He didn't need to, because storms, after all, don't start with thunder. They start with the air changing, with a look, a word, a sigh. Reddick moved on, unaware he had already lit the match, unaware that in this cabin, on this day, he had chosen the wrong pair of passengers to provoke. What he dismissed as weakness was, in truth, restraint, and restraint always has its limit. Some storms begin with a sigh before the thunder arrives. Reddick Marr's polished black shoes struck the aisle carpet with clipped, irritated precision. The cabin air hadn't even settled, and already his jaw was clenched tight. His eyes, narrow and scanning, darted from overhead bin to overhead bin as he moved with an impatience that did more to unsettle than organize. A father, cradling a sleeping infant in row 4, flinched as Reddick snapped the bin shut above him with more force than necessary. A young businessman in row 7 whispered something to his neighbor and adjusted his laptop to avoid eye contact. But it was when Reddick reached row 9 that the real fracture began to form. Kiren Darrin sat in the aisle seat, quietly tapping his pencil against the fiberglass shell of his cast. His robotics notes, slightly wrinkled and annotated with symbols, rested on his lap. The rhythm of his tapping was steady, a form of focus, a mental fortress he'd built to keep nerves at bay. His crutches, silver and worn at the grips, leaned against his seat, angled slightly into the narrow aisle, just enough to be noticed, just enough to provoke. Without breaking stride, Reddick's foot struck the base of one crutch. It clattered sideways, the metal smacking the floor and bouncing against Kiren's leg. The boy winced, his fingers freezing mid-tap. For a split second, the sound drew a few glances, but Reddick kept moving as if nothing had happened, as if it had been the boy's fault for daring to occupy space. "Sorry," Kiren mumbled, his voice small, barely above a breath as he leaned forward to reposition the crutches. From the window seat, Dr. Jorvan Darrin shifted his gaze up from his tablet, his brow tightening. He had been reviewing projection slides for his upcoming contract presentation, simulations and design schematics for adaptive navigation software, but the moment the crutch hit the floor, his focus narrowed to something far more immediate. His son hadn't cried out, hadn't protested, but the subtle way Kiren tucked his chin downward told Jorvan all he needed to know. He didn't react, not yet. He simply watched. Reddick made his way back down the aisle a minute later, now performing a pantomime of duty. He straightened an air sickness bag that had slipped halfway from its pocket, pulled a tray table closed with theatrical flair, and even gestured brusquely for a boy in row 6 to keep the window shade halfway down per protocol. Every movement screamed of someone not managing a cabin, but exerting dominance over it. When he neared Kiren again, he slowed just enough to speak. "Let's keep these out of the aisle next time," he muttered, eyes fixed ahead but voice laced with scorn. "People trip. Or worse, we're late." Kiren blinked, unsure if the comment was meant to be helpful or hostile. Jorvan's eyes didn't leave Reddick. He studied the man the same way he analyzed design flaws during audits, calmly, completely, and with quiet certainty. He noted the nervous energy in the way Reddick tapped his fingers after speaking, the faint hitch in his breathing when someone passed too close. This wasn't just a man on edge. This was someone masking deeper instability beneath a thin layer of control. The surrounding passengers were beginning to notice, too. A middle-aged man with a salt-and-pepper beard in row 10 adjusted his seat to glance backward. Another, younger passenger with a dark green hoodie in row 8 briefly removed his earbuds. Even the silence around them had changed, less ambient, more aware. Jorvan leaned slightly toward Kiren. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low. Kiren nodded quickly. "Yeah, just trying to stay out of his way." "That's not your job," Jorvan replied gently, squeezing his shoulder once. Reddick returned again moments later. Another bin shut. Another exaggerated sigh. As he passed Kiren's row a third time, he gave the Crutches a subtle glance, and this time, instead of saying anything, he gave one a sharp nudge with the side of his shoe. Not enough to knock it over, just enough for Kiren to feel it, just enough to send a message. Kiren looked down at the floor, jaw tightening. He shifted the Crutches again and returned to his notes, trying to bury himself in circuits and joint design algorithms. But his pencil no longer tapped. His hand had stopped. Jorvan saw everything, every motion, every calculation Reddick thought he'd executed unnoticed. A lesser man might have stood up, spoken out, drawn battle lines, but Jorvan believed in systems, in strategies. And right now, the system was watching. The moment was being recorded, not by phones, not yet, but by memory. His memory. As Reddick passed by for a final check, Jorvan tilted his head and said softly, not to his son, but to the air between them, "Some people test their limits without realizing they're crossing them." Reddick heard it. He paused, half-turned, and gave a sharp breath through his nose that could have passed as a laugh. "You two settled?" he asked, forcing a plastic grin. "We've got a schedule to keep." Kiren didn't answer. Jorvan didn't either. The silence that met Reddick's question was heavier than any response could have been. He turned and walked on, unaware that the line he thought he was drawing between authority and compliance was slowly wrapping itself around his own ankles like wire. From behind, a young man near the emergency exit section whispered to another, "What's that guy's deal?" No one answered, because the question didn't need answering. It only needed time. Every spark lands somewhere, it just hasn't caught fire yet. When the aircraft finally pushed back from the gate, the faint whir of engines filled the cabin, and the overhead lights dimmed to a soft glow. Kiren Darrin shifted in his seat, trying to position his casted leg without bumping the tray table. The safety demonstration began at the front, but his attention was divided. His heart beat a little faster every time he saw the blur of a navy blue uniform striding past, the steps of Flight Attendant Reddick Marr, who moved as if every footstep was a protest against having to be there. Reddick's gait was sharp, clipped, and impatient. He slammed a bin shut above row 11 with enough force to make a passenger flinch. As he neared Kiren's row, he paused for a moment, peering down at the teen's brace and the crutches tucked near his feet. Kiren instinctively adjusted his position to tuck them further in, not wanting to be a burden, but it didn't matter. Reddick leaned slightly toward another attendant, a man with sandy hair and a tired expression, and muttered with enough volume to be heard across the aisle. "Some people use injuries for attention." The words hung in the air like spilled ink, slow to settle but impossible to clean. Kiren heard it. Every syllable. His shoulders slumped, his fingers tightening around the armrest as if to squeeze the sting away. The safety video's cheerful voice droned on in contrast, an unsettling backdrop to a moment that had already begun to fracture. From across the aisle, a middle-aged man in a charcoal suit tilted his phone slightly upward, casually beginning to record. He wasn't the only one who had heard the comment. 2 passengers near the front turned subtly, exchanging glances. But Reddick didn't notice. He was already walking away, his spine rigid, his steps echoing with silent hostility. Beside Kiren, Dr. Jorvan Darrin remained silent, his face unreadable, but his hand moved slowly, deliberately, and rested on his son's shoulder. It was a gentle but grounding touch, meant less for comfort and more for communication. "I saw. I heard. I'm here." His gaze followed Reddick's path down the aisle like a mathematician watching a faulty pattern form. As the plane began taxiing, the subtle rumble of motion vibrated through the floor. Kiren leaned down to brace his leg against the upcoming lift. The angle of ascent always caused a bit of pain, and he'd prepared for it, until Reddick passed again and snapped, "Sit still." Startled, Kiren looked up. "I'm just trying to—" "I said, sit still." Reddick cut him off sharply without even turning his head. His tone wasn't instructional, it was scolding, like Kiren had intentionally disrupted the sanctity of the cabin. A flare of heat rushed to Kiren's face, half embarrassment, half disbelief. The man across the aisle lowered his phone and pressed his thumb to stop the recording. His jaw clenched. Jorvan straightened in his seat. His calm exterior hadn't shifted, but his eyes sharpened. He didn't speak yet, not because he lacked the words, but because he was still calculating. One of the most dangerous things about Jorvan Darrin wasn't his wealth or reputation, it was his ability to measure systems, and people, with ruthless accuracy. And right now, Reddick Marr was being measured. Turbulence struck lightly as the aircraft lifted off, a tremor that made the overhead bins creak. Kiren flinched involuntarily, his injured leg jerking slightly. It was the body's natural response to pain, instinctive, uncontrollable. Reddick, returning up the aisle, paused and sneered. "Too dramatic for a simple bump," he muttered, just loud enough for several rows to hear. Kiren looked down, his hands folded over his lap. He didn't want to cause a scene, didn't want to be seen as fragile, didn't want to be seen at all. The fight that rose in his chest had nowhere to go. His voice felt locked behind the weight of years spent trying to avoid being the problem. Jorvan leaned slightly forward, finally speaking, his voice measured and low but filled with a tone that demanded respect. "Mr. Marr, show basic respect." It wasn't a request. It was a warning delivered in calm. Reddick turned his head slowly, then smiled, a smirk more than a smile, thin and dismissive. "Of course, sir." "Just keeping things orderly," he replied with mock politeness before turning away as if nothing had happened. But his confidence was misplaced. He hadn't read the room. More importantly, he hadn't read the man sitting in 14C. Several passengers had. They noticed the shift in Jorvan's posture, the narrowed focus in his gaze. He wasn't angry, not yet, but the pieces were aligning. Kiren exhaled shakily. Jorvan didn't look at him. He didn't need to. His hand returned briefly to his son's shoulder, and that was enough. Outside the window, clouds drifted past like indifferent witnesses. Inside the cabin, tension coiled beneath civility. The safety demonstration was over, but something far more dangerous was unfolding, unspoken, ticking forward. Reddick Marr continued down the aisle, head high, certain that he'd asserted control, but the irony was already thick in the air. He thought he had faced a teenager and a quiet father. He had no idea he'd just triggered a man who dismantled billion-dollar systems with nothing but foresight and restraint. A quiet father is not the same as a powerless one. Reddick Marr reached their row with mechanical precision, his cart rattling against the armrests as he halted beside Kiren and Jorvan. His jaw was tight, his brows low, and his posture carried the tautness of someone fighting not just time, but something deeper, an unseen frustration clawing its way to the surface. He didn't smile, didn't ask what they wanted. Instead, he stared down at them as if waiting for an excuse. Kiren looked up with polite hesitation. "Could I have some water, please? With extra ice, it helps the swelling." For a split second, Reddick didn't respond. Then, slowly, he rolled his eyes so dramatically that even the nearby passengers could feel the insult drip from his silence. "I don't have time for special requests," he muttered sharply, reaching instead for a lukewarm bottle. Jorvan's eyes flicked up. He didn't say a word, but his hand stilled mid-movement over his tablet, his posture shifting slightly, not in aggression, but in calculated alertness. "It's all right," Kiren said quickly, shrinking a little in his seat, voice low. "I don't need the ice, just the water's fine." The effort to sound unbothered made it worse. Reddick seemed to feed off the boy's restraint. A small, amused smirk appeared at the corner of his mouth, not the kind that eased tension, but the kind that twisted it. He leaned in suddenly, face level with Kiren, speaking in a hushed tone that was meant to avoid witnesses, but not consequence. "Maybe you shouldn't travel if you can't handle it." Kiren's throat tightened. He blinked hard. His casted leg felt heavier, the swelling sharper somehow, not from pain alone, but from the pressure of being belittled in a space that was supposed to be safe. Jorvan's nostrils flared slightly. His expression remained neutral, but every line in his face sharpened as though engraved by years of discipline. He didn't move, didn't speak, but the silence itself grew dangerous, like coals quietly banking heat. The air between them thickened. A man 3 rows back half stood. He had seen enough to sense the imbalance, but before he could speak, Jorvan raised a hand with surgical calm and motioned for him to stay seated. Not yet. The moment wasn't ready. Reddick turned his back, oblivious to the tension he had created. He pushed the cart forward with a satisfied huff, the wheels squeaking just enough to grate. The passengers around them exchanged nervous glances. Some looked toward Jorvan, perhaps wondering why such a composed man hadn't spoken yet. But they didn't see the calculations behind his stillness, the silent gathering of truth, the patience of a man who had won wars without shouting. The cart creaked toward the next row. Kiren exhaled slowly, his fingers pressing into the seat armrest. He didn't say anything, but his body sagged in subtle defeat. Jorvan placed a hand gently on his forearm, the message clear. "You are not alone." Then, without warning, the aircraft lurched. A pocket of turbulence rolled through like an invisible wave. Drinks clinked. The cart rattled. Several passengers reached instinctively for their armrests. Kiren, startled, grabbed the seat in front of him to brace his leg from twisting. His injured foot shifted, and he clenched his jaw against the jolt of pain that flashed up his side. Reddick spun around. His eyes locked onto Kiren's bracing posture, and rather than registering it as pain, as precaution, he saw defiance. "What are you doing?" Reddick snapped, stepping back into their row. Kiren opened his mouth to explain, but Reddick was already moving. His steps were quick, angry, fueled not by duty but by something unspoken. The nearby passengers froze. The aisle seemed narrower. The air seemed thinner. Jorvan straightened in his seat, his eyes locked on the flight attendant's sudden return. His hand moved to Kiren's shoulder again, not to calm him this time, but to anchor him, to prepare. "I said sit still," Reddick barked. "He wasn't," Jorvan began, his voice calm but edged. Reddick didn't wait for the sentence to finish. He leaned over Kiren again, his shadow casting over both father and son. "If you need that much attention," he hissed, "maybe you should fly private next time." The words were a jab, but the tone was a blade. Kiren shrank back, eyes wide, his throat too tight to answer. Jorvan's expression didn't shift, but the energy around him did. Like a pressure system, something was building inside him. His fingers tapped once on the tray table. A signal, not a fidget. "Water's over," Reddick added, waving a dismissive hand and turning to go. "Don't expect catering next." He didn't make it 2 steps. Another bout of turbulence rippled through the fuselage, heavier this time, more sudden. A few overhead bins rattled. A glass clinked and toppled somewhere down the aisle. Kiren instinctively reached again for the seat in front of him, trying to keep weight off his cast. Reddick turned again. His eyes flashed with suspicion, not concern. "Don't play games with me," he said, louder this time. The cabin tensed as passengers began turning their heads. Something was brewing, something they didn't understand, but could feel. Then came the shift. Reddick began striding back toward Kiren, his steps clipped and fast, his hand twitching at his side. Jorvan's voice, though soft, landed like iron. "That's enough." But Reddick didn't slow down. He looked as if he had made a decision, an arrogant one, backed by years of thinking consequences only happened to others. He was wrong, and as he closed in on the boy with fast, angry steps, passengers held their breath. Reddick had no idea he was marching directly into the moment that would become the breaking point of Flight 709. Some warnings don't need words. They announce themselves in the air. Reddick Marr stormed back down the aisle, his black shoes slapping against the floor with clipped, impatient strides. The metal of the beverage cart clinked behind him, but he ignored it. His eyes were locked on row 9, on the boy with the cast and the crutches. On the one he had already mocked. His face was twisted into something no longer masked by professionalism. He didn't see a passenger anymore. He saw an inconvenience that had bruised his pride in front of half the cabin, and that pride now sought a target. Passengers turned their heads as the flight attendant's expression darkened. Kiren Darrin instinctively pulled his hands toward his lap, noticing the flicker of hostility in the man's eyes. He assumed more harsh words were coming, perhaps another belittling comment, but something in Reddick's body language signaled danger. Not irritation, not annoyance, something sharper. He sat stiffly, fingers curled around the edge of his seat, trying to steady his breath. The cast on his leg had shifted slightly from turbulence moments earlier, and he'd leaned forward instinctively to brace it, a harmless motion. A motion of self-preservation. But Reddick misread it. Or perhaps he chose to. His voice sliced through the cabin like a dropped tray. "Sit back right now," he barked. The command rattled the air, startling passengers across 3 rows. A baby down the aisle began to cry. Kiren opened his mouth to explain, but his voice faltered under pressure. My leg." "I said now." Reddick snapped again, and before anyone could stop him, he lunged forward. With a force far beyond what was necessary or appropriate, he shoved Kiren's shoulder backward. The boy, caught off guard, lost balance. One of his crutches clattered to the floor with a hollow metallic rattle. His other arm flew out instinctively to stop it from falling further. That brief, unguarded motion exposed his chest, and in that instant, Reddick's clenched fist struck. The sound was dull but unmistakable, a thud of contact that seemed to echo. His knuckles collided just above Kiren's ribs, dangerously close to the edge of the cast. Kiren gasped, a high, shocked sound as his torso curled inward, his hands flying to where the blow had landed. Silence followed. Then came the collective intake of breath. A man seated across the aisle stood up abruptly. The phone in his hand had been recording since the earlier encounter, and now his eyes were wide with disbelief. A ripple moved through the cabin, shock, then outrage, then motion. Passengers craned to see. Some whispered, some yelled. "Did he just hit him?" one man asked in disbelief. Jorvan Darrin rose slowly, deliberately, not in panic, not in fury, but with the terrifying composure of someone who had been pushed precisely far enough. His movements were calculated as though every inch of his posture had been rehearsed in boardrooms and battlefields. His eyes never left Reddick. The flight attendant took a step back, his breath uneven. There was a flicker, brief, almost imperceptible, where he realized what he had just done. But arrogance, not accountability, filled the space between them. "I'll have him marked as a disruptive minor," Reddick growled, his voice lower now but no less menacing. "Don't test me. I'll have airport security waiting." Passengers gasped again, this time not from surprise, but fury. "Disruptive," someone snapped. "You hit him." "He's a kid," another shouted. Kiren was hunched forward, wheezing softly, one hand pressed over his ribs. His crutch lay forgotten on the floor. Every breath trembled through him like glass rattling in a frame. But even through the pain, he turned his face toward his father, his wide, frightened eyes searching for assurance, for grounding. Jorvan met his son's gaze and gave the smallest nod. Then he turned to Reddick, voice quiet as steel cooled by centuries. "You touched him." The cabin fell silent again. This silence was not the silence of confusion or fear. It was the silence that came when everyone in the room knew the ground had shifted, when something irreversible had just occurred. Passengers didn't move. They didn't speak. They watched. Reddick blinked, mouth open as if trying to form a response. But no words came. The air inside the cabin was no longer just pressurized. It was loaded with consequence. And at the center stood a father, not shouting, not threatening, but holding in his stare a truth more dangerous than rage. Behind Jorvan's eyes burned the knowledge of what Reddick had just ignited, a reckoning that would not be extinguished with apologies or paperwork. Every wrong strike creates a consequence. Reddick raised his voice again, his tone cracking like a whip across the cabin. "He's uncooperative," he barked, pointing down at Kiren, who was still clutching his chest from the earlier blow. "I have the authority to restrain disruptive passengers, minor or not." The air changed instantly. A man from row 12 shot to his feet. "That's a lie," he shouted. "I've got the whole thing recorded. You assaulted that boy." Another voice, gravelly and firm, rose from row 8. "I saw it too. You shoved him, then punched him in the chest. Don't you dare twist this." Murmurs and shouts rippled like lightning across the rows. Some passengers leaned into the aisle, others stood halfway. For the first time, Reddick looked unsure. But pride is a powerful poison. "I have training," Reddick snapped, though his voice wavered. "I have the right to maintain control. You're interfering with crew operations." His words didn't land like they used to. They floated hollowly, met with glares instead of compliance. Then came a silence, one not of calm, but of measured waiting. Jorvan stepped forward. There was no anger in his movement, only gravity. He stood with the calm presence of someone who had studied every variable, calculated every outcome. He knelt beside Kiren, placed a steadying hand on his son's shoulder, and whispered, "Breathe slowly, Kiren. In through the nose, out through the mouth." Kiren obeyed, his breaths shaky but trying. Jorvan straightened and turned his head slowly to face Reddick. His voice, when it came, was low, level, and unshakably precise. "You are escalating a situation you don't understand. I advise you to stop speaking." Reddick scoffed, his laugh brittle. "Are you threatening me?" Jorvan didn't flinch. "No, I'm informing you." The flight attendant, Varen Leek, stepped forward from the service area, clearly rattled. He had watched in paralyzed silence until now. "Reddick," he said, quietly but firmly, "this has gone too far. Let's call a supervisor." "Stay out of it, Leek," Reddick snapped, pointing a trembling finger at him. "You're not in charge here. I've got this." Varen hesitated. His body leaned slightly toward Jorvan, as if being pulled by conscience. His lips parted to say something more, but he looked at Reddick again, and stayed silent. Jorvan exhaled through his nose, watching it all like an engineer watching a damaged mechanism grind toward failure. He turned his attention back to the cabin, raising his hand gently. "Everyone, "Please remain calm," he said. "Your safety is my priority. Let's not add fear to what is already happening." The calm in his tone soothed the edges of the chaos. Passengers began lowering themselves slowly back into their seats, though eyes stayed wide and cameras stayed recording. Reddick, mistaking the moment as a win, squared his shoulders. "You're not in control here," he muttered, almost to himself. "I am." Jorvan said nothing. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step back to his seat. From the inside pocket of his blazer, he slid out a black leather wallet, worn but sharp in design. With a practiced movement, he retrieved a card, matte gray with a silver-lined emblem, and tucked it discreetly into his palm. The card wasn't just identification. It was a badge of override authority. Reddick didn't notice. Jorvan slipped the badge back into the side of his seat pocket. Its presence wasn't for now. It was for the next phase, the one that Reddick was blindly walking toward. He turned back to Kiren, who was now wincing with each breath. Jorvan crouched again, assessing the boy's ribcage gently, mentally mapping the pain's origin. "Pain level?" he asked quietly. 7, maybe 8, Kiren whispered, his voice thin. "Any sharp spikes when breathing?" Kiren nodded. Jorvan's expression didn't change, but something beneath it shifted, like a gate unlocking. He stood again and looked at Reddick. "I'm requesting a supervisor now. This is your final chance to de-escalate." Reddick laughed, but his voice cracked. "Denied. I said I'm handling it." Jorvan didn't blink. "You're not." He turned toward the intercom phone near the service station and took a measured step forward. Reddick blocked his path. "You touch that, I'll have you removed from this flight." Jorvan tilted his head. "You already struck my son. There's nothing more damaging you can do except continue speaking." Reddick clenched his fists. His face flushed red with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Jorvan's eyes scanned the room briefly, calculating. He saw Darrin shift again, his eyes flicking toward the captain's cabin. Reddick hadn't noticed, but Jorvan had. The moment was nearing. "I suggest you think carefully," Jorvan said quietly, his voice like ice in the summer air. "What you choose next will define not only your career, but your future." Still, Reddick stood tall, defiant, confused by how the tide had shifted. What he didn't know was that the man he was trying to intimidate wasn't just another passenger. Jorvan Darrin was the chief systems architect behind one of the most powerful compliance oversight programs in commercial aviation. And he had just retrieved the access badge that could notify federal compliance officers before the wheels of the plane even touched down. Foreshadowing hung in the air like static before a lightning strike. Around them, the passengers watched with bated breath. Phones kept rolling. Jorvan turned back to his son and offered a quiet nod of reassurance. The only sound was the drone of the engines and the uneven beat of Reddick's shallow breath. Then Jorvan said the words that anchored the moment. "Control breaks when it's forced too hard." The aircraft jolted violently, the overhead bins shuddering as if exhaling under pressure. The seatbelt sign blinked insistently, its soft chime cutting through the tension that already gripped the cabin. Passengers stiffened, clutching their armrests. The turbulence was real, but so was the human storm brewing at row 11. "Everyone sit down." Reddick Marr's voice cracked above the din, brittle with stress but laced with an authority he no longer fully owned. He clung to the seat back for balance, his other hand gesturing sharply at passengers who had begun shifting in concern. But it wasn't control that gripped him. It was panic in a uniform. Kiren Darrin tried to sit upright, bracing against the armrest. Pain lanced through his chest from where Reddick had struck him earlier. His lips parted in a quiet gasp, face pale and glistening. Jorvan's arm moved instantly, steadying his son. His expression remained unreadable, but tension rippled through his jawline like a quiet seismic fault preparing to rupture. Across the aisle, Darrin Leek, tall, young, and visibly shaken, took a subtle step forward. He glanced left and right, then leaned close to Jorvan's ear. "I need to tell you something," he whispered urgently. "This isn't the first time." Jorvan's eyes flicked to him. Reddick's had 2 prior incidents, both involving aggression toward passengers. Management buried them. I saw one of the reports disappear from our crew portal. Jorvan's fingers tightened slightly around Kiren's shoulder. His mind, always sharp and deliberate, processed the shift instantly. This wasn't an isolated outburst, it was a pattern, a history hidden behind manipulated logs and unfiled reports. He gave Darrin a single nod. "Start documenting," Jorvan said quietly. Darrin's gaze hardened. "Understood." But Reddick had noticed the whispered exchange. His eyes narrowed, heat rising fast under his collar. To him, silence was a challenge. Calm faces were defiance. "Hey," he snapped, "you two need to stop whispering. You think this is a game?" He stepped forward, voice louder now, confidence fueled by desperation. "That crutch is still blocking the aisle. FAA protocol requires—" "You're escalating a situation you created," Jorvan replied evenly, not rising to the bait. "I'm doing my job," Reddick growled, "and right now, that means removing the obstruction." He reached down suddenly and grabbed one of Kiren's crutches, yanking it with a violent tug. The metal scraped the floor. "Wait!" Kiren gasped, holding on to the handle instinctively. "Let go," Reddick snapped. Kiren didn't. Not out of rebellion, but instinct. His body tensed, protective reflexes flaring as the casted leg bore unintended weight. Reddick pulled again, harder. The crutch twisted. Then pain. White-hot and sharp. The bottom of Kiren's cast clipped the seat frame, sending a jolt up his leg. He let out a raw, unfiltered cry, a sound too involuntary to fake and too painful to ignore. The entire cabin fell still. Not even the rumble of turbulence could overshadow that moment. It was the kind of silence that didn't ask questions. It demanded answers. Jorvan stood, not abruptly, not theatrically. He rose like a thundercloud forming slowly, imposing not by noise, but by presence. Every inch of him radiated control, but it was the type of control that unnerved. Passengers turned. Some gasped, others pulled out phones. Reddick still gripped the crutch, caught in a posture that betrayed more guilt than authority. He looked up and met Jorvan's eyes. What he saw made him flinch. Jorvan didn't yell. He didn't raise a fist. He didn't posture. He simply said, "Let go of his crutch." The words were low, measured, lethal in their calm. And then, without moving a muscle, he added with a gravity that cracked through the air like lightning through clouds. "Breaking a child's strength only builds the father's resolve." The attendant smirked, confident no one would challenge him, unaware that every executive contract, every silent witness, and every clause of authority was already turning against him. If you believe cruelty under uniform always folds when strategy meets strength, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. Reddick's knuckles whitened as he tightened his grip on Kiren's crutch and yanked with renewed force. The metal gave a groan as it bent slightly in his hand. Kiren clung to it with trembling fingers, but he was no match for the adult's strength. The crutch slipped halfway from his grasp before the sudden jerk slammed his casted leg into the hard edge of the seat frame. The crack of impact was followed by Kiren's sharp, pained gasp, raw, unfiltered, and piercing. His back arched as he grabbed at his leg, his voice catching in his throat. The cabin reacted instantly. "Hey, let him go," a man from row 10 shouted, half rising from his seat before the turbulence rocked the cabin again and the seatbelt sign dinged overhead. Reddick turned sharply, voice like a whip. "Everyone stay seated. Do not interfere with crew operations." But his shout didn't bring compliance. It brought fury. The passengers weren't just alarmed now, they were afraid, and they were angry. The air felt electrified, heavy with tension. Even the distant hum of the engines seemed quieter, as if the aircraft itself was holding its breath. Kiren clutched his leg, wincing, eyes blinking rapidly against tears of pain he was too proud to shed. Jorvan dropped to one knee, steady and composed, and gently pulled back Kiren's pant leg just enough to assess the swelling around the cast. "Did it crack?" Jorvan asked softly, his fingers careful, his voice filled with concern but not panic. Kiren shook his head, voice barely audible. "No. I think it's just swollen." Jorvan gave a small nod, but something inside him shifted, like steel locking into place. He stood slowly. Not with haste, not with fury, with purpose. Reddick, still gripping the crutch, felt the air change as Jorvan rose. The passengers quieted, as though sensing the storm had inverted. Jorvan stood to his full height, tall, calm, immovable, and took a step forward. Release. His. Crutch. His voice wasn't raised, but it echoed across the cabin like a verdict. The sound had weight, finality. Reddick instinctively stepped back, startled by the sheer authority in the man's tone, but he tried to recover, puffing up his chest. "He was being disruptive," Reddick said, voice thinner than he intended. "I needed to move this for safety." "He was injured," Jorvan said, each word as measured as a stone laid in concrete. "And you deliberately caused him pain." "You don't get to decide that," Reddick snapped. "This is my cabin, and I acted in self-defense." At that, several passengers shouted back in outrage. "Self-defense? He didn't even move." "You assaulted a kid." "We saw everything. We've got it on video." The uproar swelled, voices rising like a tide that refused to recede. Reddick turned in a slow circle, eyes darting between furious passengers, his mouth opening and closing like someone who just realized the rules had changed and he wasn't in control anymore. Jorvan stepped forward again. His expression was not angry, but precise. His voice cut through the noise with frightening calm. "You assaulted my son," he said, loud enough for every ear to catch it. "Every second you keep resisting only worsens your future." Reddick's lip curled. "I was within my rights." "You were within your impulse," Jorvan said, "and that impulse crossed into criminal." "You don't know anything about protocol." "I helped build the protocols," Jorvan interrupted, and for a moment the room froze. Even Reddick blinked. "What are you talking about?" But Jorvan didn't answer him. Instead, he turned his attention briefly back to Kiren, who had managed to sit upright, jaw clenched against the pain, hands still trembling. "You okay?" Jorvan asked quietly. Kiren nodded once. "It hurts, but I'm okay." And that was enough. Jorvan turned back toward Reddick and took one final step forward. The air between them seemed to ripple with invisible force. His next words were slower, deliberate. "You will answer for every bruise." The cabin fell silent again, as if everyone instinctively knew that this was the line where everything shifted. Jorvan's presence no longer suggested retaliation. It promised consequences. Reddick's jaw moved as if to speak again, but no sound came. His arrogance had built him a throne of paper, and now the match had been lit. A father's calm is measured until someone harms his child. The intercom crackled overhead, cutting through the noise and panic like a razor through fabric. "All crew, report to the forward galley," came the captain's voice, measured but unmistakably sharp. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Varon Leek didn't hesitate. He stepped forward from the row near the service cart, his expression pale but resolute. "I'll go," he said aloud, as much to himself as to the crew. But before he could take a second step, Reddick Marr's hand shot out and clamped around his arm. "Stay put," Reddick hissed, his voice low but brimming with panic disguised as authority. "I'm handling things." Varon looked down at the hand on his arm. For a moment he faltered, caught between fear and duty. But then he turned his head just slightly and caught the gaze of Dr. Jorvan Darrin. That calm, unshakable presence wasn't pleading for help. It was giving silent permission. Varon yanked his arm free. "Not anymore," he said firmly, stepping past Reddick and walking steadily toward the front of the aircraft. Reddick stood frozen, lips parted, eyes darting. Dramatic irony tightened its grip. He still believed he could salvage the situation, that his rank and uniform would shield him. He didn't yet realize the shield was already in pieces. Behind him, Jorvan helped Kiren reposition his swollen leg. The boy's breathing had steadied somewhat, though each movement still made him wince. Jorvan leaned close and whispered, "Breathe in through the nose, out through the mouth, just like we practiced." His hand remained anchored gently but firmly on Kiren's shoulder. Jorvan's eyes, however, were elsewhere, watching Reddick, watching the unraveling. Minutes passed. Then the curtain at the front of the cabin pulled aside, and Captain Jorvan Darrin emerged. He was a tall man, close to retirement age, with silver at his temples and the steady bearing of someone who had weathered mid-air engine failures without blinking. But this was different. His brow furrowed sharply as he took in the scene. A bruised teenage boy clenching both chest and casted leg, a cabin of passengers gesturing with urgency, and a crew member standing too still. "What happened here?" the captain asked, voice firm but devoid of theatrics. Reddick stepped forward, already playing defense. "The passenger became aggressive, sir. Uncooperative. I had to manage." "Liar!" someone in row 8 shouted. "We saw what you did." A ripple of voices followed. "He punched that kid. I've got it all recorded. He grabbed his crutch and twisted it." The captain raised one hand to calm the noise but didn't look away from Reddick. His expression hardened. "Reddick, protocol requires I isolate any crew member involved in a physical altercation pending investigation." "But it was the turbulence," Reddick said quickly, words stumbling over each other. "Things got out of hand. It's all a misunderstanding." From the aisle, Varen Leek stepped forward again. His voice was steady this time, but clear. "Sir, I witnessed the incident. There was no aggression from the boy. The assault was unprovoked." Reddick's eyes widened. "You're siding with them." "I'm siding with the truth." All the while, Jorvan remained seated. His stillness was deliberate, a composure forged from experience, not fear. He observed the unfolding breakdown with the precision of an architect studying a collapsing structure. Every gesture, every word, became part of a blueprint. Captain Darrin turned to Kiren. He crouched slightly, his voice lowering. "Son, are you hurt?" Kiren didn't speak immediately. He looked at his father first. Jorvan gave a small nod of encouragement. Then the boy answered, voice soft but steady. "Yes, sir." The word hung in the air like a gavel strike. A long silence followed, thick with gravity. Then Jorvan rose. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't point. He didn't threaten. But when he spoke, the cabin seemed to shrink around his words. "He didn't just hurt him," Jorvan said, voice colder than steel. "He chose to." The captain took only a second to decide. "Reddick, stand down and step forward to the galley." Reddick didn't move. He looked around, desperate for support, but found none. The passengers, once silent, now stared at him with a mix of contempt and disbelief. No one nodded. No one came to his defense. Reddick's breath hitched. He was outnumbered, outmatched, out of protection, and the truth had finally cornered him. Truth corners those who run from it. Reddick Marr refused to move. The captain's jaw clenched as he stepped forward, voice cutting through the cabin's hum like a blade. "Reddick, step aside now." But the flight attendant's posture only stiffened, his chest rising with indignation as he pointed at Kiren. "He was being disruptive. I was within protocol." Passengers erupted with disbelief, several shouting that they had filmed the entire assault. The young man from row 8 stood again, fists clenched at his sides. 2 men from row 10 joined him, wordlessly stepping into the aisle. Their presence was quiet but thunderous. Together they advanced, shoulders squared, forming a wall that boxed Reddick in near the galley. His confidence faltered. his feet stumbling backward until he reached the cold metal edge of the beverage cart. His voice, once sharp, now trembled. "You can't do this. I'll sue every one of you." The captain didn't flinch. "Under emergency protocol, I can and I will." He turned to a nearby panel and activated a toggle switch embedded under a red plastic guard. A chime echoed softly, followed by a mechanical click overhead. The cabin lights dimmed momentarily, barely perceptible, but it was enough to signify the system had shifted into a new mode. A pale blue LED on the crew display blinked 3 times. Emergency Cabin Security Protocol. Active. Reddick's face went pale. He wasn't just being reprimanded, he was being declared a threat under formal procedure. His body language changed. He stopped yelling. Instead, he looked around, searching for support among the crew. But none came. Even Varen Leek, who had earlier tried to reason with him, stood motionless, arms crossed and face set with silent resolve. The other attendants remained at their posts, frozen between duty and shame. Meanwhile, Jorvan had risen slowly beside his son. Kiren lay back in his seat, his casted leg elevated on a makeshift support made of bundled jackets offered by nearby passengers. His chest rose and fell unevenly. A small red mark remained where Reddick's fist had landed earlier. Jorvan's eyes didn't stray from his son's face. "Keep your focus on your breath," he said softly, adjusting the collar of Kiren's hoodie with one hand. "I've got the rest." Then he stood and walked forward. The air changed around him. He didn't raise his voice, didn't move fast, but something about the stillness in his step made passengers straighten, made the captain's brow lift in anticipation. Jorvan stopped just shy of the galley. "I'm Dr. Jorvan Darrin," he said, voice steady, eyes sharp. "Chief Architect of the Nexlaran Audit Grid." The captain's head turned sharply. The moment the words were spoken, it was as though a blueprint had been laid over the moment, revealing everything that Reddick had failed to calculate. Nexlaran Audit Grid, the software system recently implemented by the airline. A powerful network designed not just to flag misconduct but to store incident telemetry, time-stamped passenger and crew logs, behavioral patterns, and internal system overrides. And Jorvan Darrin wasn't just someone familiar with it, he had built it. That meant one thing. Jorvan had authority. He could, with one command, trigger a code gray landing review, an emergency compliance lock that would freeze all flight logs, employee records, camera systems, and personnel files in real time, making it impossible for anyone within the company to alter or destroy data before a Federal Ethics Review Board could access it. The captain's lips parted. "You're that Dr. Darrin?" Jorvan nodded once. "And I am not here to disrupt your chain of command, but I will not allow the assault on my son to vanish into paperwork." Reddick's entire demeanor collapsed in an instant. His voice cracked from behind the barrier of passengers. "That's not fair. I didn't even hit him that hard." The man from row 8 spun. "We all saw you punch him in the chest. A kid with a cast." Phones lifted again in unison, screens showing paused video feeds of the exact moment. The light from the screens glowed like truth made visible. Jorvan turned to the captain. "With your permission, I'd like to begin the incident statement log." The captain took a long breath and nodded, gesturing toward the jump seat cabinet. "Of course." He retrieved a bound document marked with the airline's seal and handed it to Jorvan, who accepted it with care, as if it were a legal ledger in a courtroom, which, in many ways, it was. Passengers leaned forward, breath held. The moment was not loud, but it roared in its implication. Jorvan took out a slim pen, clicked it once, and wrote the first words into the log. The ink dried instantly against the paper as he noted the time, cabin pressure reading, and location of the aircraft en route. His handwriting was meticulous, every stroke a hammer in the building of a case. Behind him, Reddick trembled. His bravado had dissolved into silence. His eyes locked onto the pen in Jorvan's hand, as if it were the blade carving open the walls around him. Jorvan didn't speak again. He simply wrote, capturing truth before anyone else could distort it. He knew what came next. But for now, this was enough. And as Reddick's knees bent slightly from the weight of fear, the last line of warning echoed through the quiet cabin, like the hush before a storm fully arrives. Some consequences arrive like storms, slow at first, then absolute. Reddick sat restrained in the jump seat near the galley, arms crossed, jaw locked. He stared straight ahead, pretending calm, but his eyes darted toward the cabin every few seconds. Around him, the murmurs of passengers filled the air like a rising tide. Some whispered in disbelief. Others simply stared in silence. The tension was a living thing now, pulsing through every row. Jorvan sat next to his son, his face carved from quiet steel. Kiren rested with his leg elevated, his chest still sore from the punch. A flight blanket had been rolled and tucked under his cast, a small act of kindness from the man in row 10. The boy's breathing was steadier now, but his face showed the wear of pain and shock. Jorvan glanced at him, then returned to the logbook in his lap, documenting every detail, timestamps, passenger movements, the sequence of verbal exchanges, the precise moment Reddick struck his son. Each stroke of the pen was deliberate, clinical, and calm, as though Jorvan were preparing a technical blueprint, except this one would be used to dismantle a man's career. The cabin's stillness was deceptive. Emotions rippled beneath every breath. Rage, fear, guilt, uncertainty. Dramatic irony thickened in the air. Reddick still believed there was time to spin the narrative, to claim confusion, to play victim. What he didn't know, couldn't know, was that the man seated beside the injured boy was not merely a passenger, not merely a father. Jorvan Darrin was the architect of the very audit grid the airline used to track misconduct, and he hadn't even begun. The captain passed through quietly, pausing by their row. His expression was taut, his voice low. "How is he?" Jorvan didn't look up. Bruised, breathing is steady. The captain nodded solemnly. "I'm truly sorry, sir. This never should have happened." "You're right," Jorvan replied, meeting his gaze now. "It shouldn't have, but we still have a chance to handle it correctly." A few rows back, Baron Leek stepped forward again, carrying a cup of ice water. He held it with both hands, careful not to spill. "For Kiren," he said softly. "And I'm sorry, too. I should have stepped in sooner." Kiren managed a weak smile as he accepted the cup. "Thank you," he said, voice hoarse. Jorvan nodded once in acknowledgement. Then, slowly and silently, he reached into his briefcase and retrieved a small object no one had yet seen. A matte black encrypted fob, no larger than a car key. It clicked once in his hand as he activated it, a soft blue glow illuminating the edges. Inside that device was a program, the Integrity Freeze Directive, a failsafe designed for the worst of corporate violations. It could lock every digital file, log entry, and personnel note related to a specific incident in real time. Nothing could be altered or deleted once activated. Not by managers, not by IT, not even by executives. It bypassed internal systems entirely and reported directly to the Federal Ethics Review Board. Reddick, still watching from the jump seat, furrowed his brow at the glow. He couldn't see the fob clearly, but something about Jorvan's posture unsettled him. He shifted in his seat, muttering to himself. "What is that?" Reddick asked, trying to sound casual but failing. Jorvan didn't respond immediately. He turned the fob in his hand, checking the activation light, then murmured under his breath, "No one hides behind systems today." The words, though quiet, seemed to ripple across the nearby seats. Darrin, who had stepped aside but stayed within earshot, froze as if he understood their meaning. A man 2 rows ahead leaned slightly back, pretending not to listen but clearly absorbing every word. Jorvan gently placed the fob on his tray table. Then he resumed writing, detailing every escalation, Each time Reddick yelled, each moment Kiren flinched, every witness who stepped forward. Each fact was a thread in a net being quietly, irrevocably woven. Reddick's bravado wavered. He looked down at his uniform, at the name badge now crumpled from where the captain had pulled him aside earlier. His eyes flicked toward the door. Maybe there was still a chance. Maybe he could file a report before they landed, claim confusion, call someone in management. Then he looked back at Jorvan and realized, slowly, terribly, that whatever chance he thought he had was already gone. That fob, it wasn't just a gadget, it was judgment. A teenage boy, hurt. A plane full of witnesses. Video recordings. A captain already logging testimony. And now, this. One passenger whispered, "He's the audit guy. The one who built the system." Another gasped softly, and Reddick, for the first time, looked genuinely afraid. His voice cracked as he stammered, This is just a misunderstanding. I didn't mean to." He flinched. That's all. Kiren looked up, pain still etched into his face. He said nothing, just watched. Jorvan didn't respond either. He didn't need to. The entire cabin had become a quiet jury, and the evidence was still unfolding. The blue light on the fob blinked twice, ready for activation. Jorvan didn't press the button yet. He waited. He wanted the last pieces in place. This wasn't vengeance. This was precision, and it had to be airtight. Foreshadowing hung like a shadow behind his final words of the chapter. Words that made Reddick's heart sink as if a trap door had opened beneath his seat. Jorvan turned to Kiren again and adjusted the blanket around his leg. His voice softened. "You're safe now." Then, returning his gaze to the restrained man, he whispered once more. Not loud, but loud enough. "When the truth points in one direction, the lies begin to fall apart." The wheels struck the tarmac with a heavy thud. Kiren gripped the armrest, his fingers trembling for more than just the landing. Beside him, Dr. Jorvan Darrin's hand remained steady over his son's, offering a calm that belied the electric tension now pulsing through the cabin. The cabin lights flickered as the engines slowed, and the captain's voice crackled through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We'll be met at the gate by security personnel. For your safety, do not leave your seats until instructed." No names were mentioned, no reasons given. But the undertone in the captain's voice was unmistakable. Something serious was about to happen. Jorvan leaned closer to Kiren. "Everything is under control. Don't move until they come." Kiren gave a faint nod, his breathing shallow but more stable than before. Across the cabin, passengers sat stiff and quiet, exchanging glances but saying little. The tension was no longer hidden. It sat thick in the air, heavy on every chest, including Reddick Marr's. The flight attendant, once so sure of his untouchable authority, was now visibly unraveling. He hunched low in his seat by the galley, whispering frantically under his breath, eyes darting toward Jorvan, toward the cockpit, toward the door. His lips moved with no sound, rehearsing excuses no one would believe. His hands trembled against the metal edge of the storage latch beside him. As the jet bridge sealed against the door, a low chime sounded. The door opened. 3 uniformed security officers stepped aboard with brisk precision, eyes sharp, shoulders squared. Passengers held their breath, anticipating a march toward the back, maybe to ask questions, maybe to speak with Jorvan. But that didn't happen. The officers walked straight to Reddick. Not a word, not a glance toward anyone else. Reddick blinked rapidly, standing halfway, confused. Wait, there's been some misunderstanding," he stammered, hands raised in shallow protest. Look, I didn't. He was being uncooperative." Captain Jorvan Darrin appeared behind the officers, his expression carved from stone. In one hand, he held a statement log. In the other, a USB drive filled with video clips passengers had voluntarily shared. He extended both toward the lead officer. "Everything's here. Timeline. Witness names. "Passenger recordings," the captain stated quietly. "They'll confirm what you need." At that moment, Jorvan rose, not with haste, but with a quiet authority that turned heads. He pulled from his jacket a sleek silver fob, no larger than a keychain. Its center screen glowed dimly. He stepped forward. "I'm activating the Integrity Freeze Directive," Jorvan said, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. He pressed his thumb to the fob. The screen flashed blue. The officers' radios beeped in immediate confirmation. Connection made. Authority recognized. The airline's personnel system had just locked. All digital records, past complaints, access logs, crew reports were now sealed. No one could erase anything. No one could edit, override, or interfere. Reddick's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came. He looked as if the air had been pulled from his lungs. In a final act of desperation, he stuttered, I only lightly touched the boy. It wasn't an attack. You don't understand. He moved suddenly. I didn't mean—" "Enough," a man from row 12 shouted. "He hit the boy. We saw it," another echoed from the front. Kiren, pale but resolute, raised his voice. It trembled, but it cut through the air like a blade. "You hurt me." The words fell into silence. Dense. Crushing. Reddick's face contorted, shock, shame, and disbelief wrestling in his eyes. But his struggle ended the moment one of the officers took him by the arm. "You're being detained under Federal Aviation Assault Guidelines," the lead officer said. "Anything you say from here on will be recorded." Cuffs clicked. Reddick didn't resist. He only looked down, defeated, the facade of control fully shattered. Jorvan turned back toward his son. "I'm requesting medical evaluation for my boy," he told the captain. Captain Tarek gave a nod. "They're already on standby outside the jet bridge. We'll get him immediate attention." As the officers guided Reddick toward the exit, passengers began to applaud softly, not out of celebration, but out of a shared recognition that something wrong had been confronted, and something right had been done. Before Jorvan disembarked, the captain placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry this happened on my flight," he said, voice heavy with sincerity. Jorvan looked at him, not with anger, but with steady clarity. "What matters is what happens next. Some endings are written the moment truth steps forward." The moment the cabin door opened and the sterile breath of the jet bridge met the pressurized air of Flight 709, a wave of subdued chaos unfolded. 3 paramedics waited just outside, having been pre-briefed en route by the captain's crew on an in-flight assault involving a minor. Their eyes scanned the passengers for the injured, until Kiren Darrin was gently helped forward by his father. His weight shifted to one crutch, the other left behind after the incident. The boy's face was pale, his breathing shallow, a bruise darkening just beneath his collarbone. "Chest impact, potential leg aggravation," one medic murmured into his radio as he extended a gloved hand. "We've got you, son," said the lead paramedic, his tone low but urgent. As they carefully examined Kiren's upper torso for signs of fracture, Jorvan knelt beside his son. His expression was unreadable to most, composed, but with an undercurrent of steel. He wasn't just present as a father, he was present as a force. "You're all right," Jorvan said softly, brushing Kiren's curls from his forehead. "They'll make sure everything is documented, and you did nothing wrong." Kiren winced as the stethoscope pressed against his chest. He looked up, guilt flickering behind his eyes. "I didn't mean to make it worse," he whispered. "I didn't mean for it to turn into this." Jorvan shook his head slowly. "You didn't cause this. He did." The paramedics exchanged glances. One of them noted Kiren's blood pressure reading. The numbers were stable, but his body trembled with the aftershock of the trauma. They wrapped his leg, reinforced the splint, and recommended a short transport to the nearby Crenmore Clinic for imaging. Jorvan agreed immediately. Meanwhile, outside Gate 19A, Reddick Marr was being escorted through a private side exit of the terminal by 2 federal officers in dark blue jackets. He was no longer shouting, no longer smirking. The Integrity Freeze Directive had already triggered a priority red audit. One officer held a tablet syncing live to the encrypted portal Jorvan's fob had unlocked. On the screen, a backlog of misconduct complaints bearing Reddick's name, entries long buried or unsubstantiated by middle management. Now, each case had re-emerged like a long-denied truth crawling from the walls. One file read, Incident 017B, Passenger Injury/Flight 1347, denied. Reason inconclusive. Another, Incident 009. A. Verbal abuse toward minor, settled quietly. The officer leading Reddick turned to his partner. This wasn't the first time, and management buried every one of them. Dramatic irony thickened in the hallway air. The very systems Reddick had relied on to shield his misconduct, favoritism, deflection, and a culture of silence were now stripped from him in real time, his past failures scrolling upward like a digital reckoning. At Crenmore Clinic, Kiren was wheeled into radiology. The physician, a tall man with years of battlefield trauma experience, reviewed the scans and confirmed the leg injury had not worsened. His ribs were bruised, not broken. Jorvan, seated beside the bed, took the news with a quiet nod, but his hand remained firmly wrapped around his son's. Kiren's fingers squeezed back, weakly but with trust. A nurse gently handed over a small bag of ice and a bottle of water. "Your son is brave," he said, addressing Jorvan. "He didn't cry, not once." Jorvan met the man's eyes. "He's been through worse than most people twice his age." By dusk, the news had already begun to circulate on local feeds. Incident on Helion Air Flight 709. Passenger assault under federal review. But it was the press conference held later that evening on the steps outside Crenmore Medical Center that changed everything. A modest podium had been set up. Jorvan stood before it, dressed not in corporate armor, but in the plain gray blazer he had worn during the flight. His voice, however, carried the gravitas of a leader who had spent years building systems of accountability. "I want to speak not just as a father," he began, his tone steady and deliberate, "but as someone who helped design the very systems airlines now use to protect their passengers. Today, those systems worked, but they should have worked sooner." Flashes from reporters lit the steps. His words echoed under the hospital awning as he continued. "No employee, no matter how protected by paperwork, should ever be allowed to harm a child and walk away with impunity. Today, I'm announcing the creation of a new national standard, the Passenger Protection Accord. This framework will ensure that no crew member with a history of abuse can be shielded by bureaucracy again." A murmur rippled through the crowd, then applause, from passengers who had attended in quiet support, from the medics who'd treated Kiren, and from advocates already mobilizing online. At that exact hour, Reddick sat alone in a holding room, the lights cold, the silence unforgiving. A printed list of reopened cases lay on the table before him, and for the first time, he had no excuse left to hide behind. As the hospital ward quieted and Kiren rested with soft breathing under a warmed blanket, Jorvan remained at his side. The machines hummed faintly. The world outside was moving quickly now. Legal charges, flight safety committees, internal audits. But inside that small room, the only thing that mattered was the boy who had endured it all and the man who refused to let him face it alone. Kiren stirred slightly. His eyes opened halfway. "You kept me safe," he whispered. Jorvan smiled, squeezed his hand, and replied, "Always. A father's strength is measured by the justice he brings after the harm is done." The strike that hit the boy became the evidence that crushed the entire airline. Careers evaporated, contracts dissolved, and the attendant's future collapsed before his next breath. If you believe real authority moves with precision, discipline, and unstoppable force, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights abuse of authority, prejudice, and the power of calm, strategic action in confronting wrongdoing. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, accountability, and protecting every family with dignity and respect.